Good evening. On behalf of ILWU Local 23, I'd like to welcome you to our dispatch hall for the Propeller Club event of 2016. My name is Dean McGrath. I'm the president of ILWU Local 23. It's important. There's a concept that I've been talking to some legislators about and also with some shippers. In the last 6 months to almost a year now, I've been reaching out to shippers in Washington. That started off in part because of the conflict that existed between the PMA and ILWU last year. And before I go into much of that, I would also like to say that I'm speaking for Local 23 only. There are some serious problems in the shipping industry and a lot of change going on right now. Before I go into those, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about something that I've experienced in talking to a lot of shippers last year. People that we typically, our paths don't necessarily cross on an everyday basis, but we have become linked and interdependent on each other more so now than ever, and a lot of that was due to the conflict last year. But in reaching out to those, a lot of people on the east side of the mountains, hay, apples, exports basically. In the communication, there's a lot we don't know about each other. And as much as we are linked, I think our approach to solving some of the problems in the future have to be linked. We have to have a more regional approach. And that is in part to deal with the changes in the shipping industry. But I am also not naive to the fact that when I talk to shippers, their number one concern is how do we avoid what happened last year. And I also want to avoid that ever happening. And I think the answer for both of those problems, how to solve the industry problems and how to solve that from happening again, the answer is the same. It's a regional approach. The more we're interconnected, the more that we know about each other, and the more entities that are pushing in the same direction, the less likelihood that not only could a light would be drawn on the situation, and I think negotiations would have went much better. And that is as much as I can offer you, and I'll give you more of a labor perspective on that in a moment. Before I go much farther into the problems we're facing and the solution that I think we have, I'd like to share, I feel communication is important, and I'd like to share the locals' perspective, what I hear from my workforce, so that not only shippers but the companies better understand where we're coming from. Our participation, our input, it needs to be valued and appreciated. These are not only our jobs, they're our lives. And there's a rich history to that. We can be used as a tool for the employers if they truly understand that our futures are tied together. Our brothers and sisters built these docks. They labor on these docks, and sometimes they died on these docks. It's our duties to keep them thriving. The ports and the communities that surround them are us. We built them with our sweat and labor, and we're vested in that. So that needs the sacredness of that needs to be recognized. This isn't just a job to us. It's a 24-hour, around-the-clock operation that we're highly invested in. Another thing to really take into consideration in these ports, I'll spend my career here. I won't be 5 years here going to another company, moving on to something else. I will spend my whole career here. I've seen many company managers, many companies come and go. Their decisions have come and gone, but the one thing that will be consistent in these ports are the unions. I'd like to talk about some industry changes and challenges, specifically challenges that are relevant to the Northwest. The industry changes, I think, that are drastically affecting the industry that you don't hear a ton about. You heard nothing about last year, but are hugely, hugely game changers are big ships and, more importantly, alliances. We'll go into that. The two challenges that I see that need to be number one is the harbor maintenance tax and rail rates. specifically rail rates in the Northwest in comparison to Canada and down south. For an oversimplified, easy view of the old model versus the new model in relations to big ships and alliances, it's depicted here. What we're looking at here was the old, smaller ships, one company for the most part, one company's cargo, depicted in each of these here. As they have also formed alliances, they are sharing ships also, mega ships, and what that means to terminals we're going to get into in a moment. But instead of having each of these smaller ships come into a terminal, you're having a larger ship which not only has one variety of cargo, but has got, as I mentioned here, various interests. There's also, in part, what we've saw is less stops and less ports being visited. It's my opinion that these alliances and bigger ships are crippling the industry. Has it created lower slot fees? Absolutely. Is that good? You be the judge after we're done here. It's created overcapacity, which if that would not have happened if the industry continued to grow and the bigger ships and capacity weighed out, we wouldn't be in the situation we are now. But as we are right now, there's too much capacity on these big ships. What happens to the terminals is you have, instead of those smaller ships, which the terminals were built for with one single line's cargo, you're now getting a massive offload of various cargo all at one terminal. That creates huge congestion. The terminals, again, even going back to operating systems, were built to receive that one company's industry, that one company's containers, whether it be 40, 45s, 20s, and then they have to plan the yards accordingly to get out on rail. Now, instead of one company's planning a train for one, you're planning a train for up to 5 companies in some of these alliances. What it's also meant for the terminals is shrunken windows. And by windows, I'm talking about either receiving windows, the amount of time that once that container reaches the dock, the trucking company has to either get it in or get it off. Those windows used to extend sometimes beyond 5 days, much more. Now we're seeing 3 days. I will show you a perfect example of what that's meant in Tacoma when you have lines of trucks, endless trucks going down the road for sometimes up to a mile. It's because those shrunken windows have caused everyone to have to come in and get this massive cargo in a short period of time. That has also led to what I like to just call overall poor service. The terminals are struggling to adapt to the alliances and the amount of cargo coming off. These industry changes are not going away. Ports that want to be competitive are going to have to adapt. I think we can do that in this area, but we also need to be cognizant of some special challenges that only the Northwest faces. I'll talk about those now. One is a harbor maintenance tax, and that tax that is imposed on any containers coming into the United States via ship, and it was designed to only be used on dredging. There is a good bill to change that, but as it stands now, we're basically paying for our competitors in the United States to dredge their harbors, and we have seen a significant investments to dredge over the last 10 years from New Jersey, Savannah, a lot of the Gulf ports, and they are the direct benefits of that tax. While we have natural deepwater ports, we cannot spend that money. It's a huge obstacle for the Northwest. The other one that I'm going to talk about are rail rates, and in our area, around 70% of the cargo that comes in is getting put on rail and going to Chicago. Why that's more of a challenge is it's from $200 to $400 less per container to have that go on rail from Prince Rupert or Vancouver directly into Chicago. And the rail rates are much cheaper in California. In addition to that, California's rates going this way to Shanghai, for example, are less per box due to the volume and the contracts the steam lines have down there. No shortage of challenges in the Northwest again. So take, for example, this big ship is now coming in with maybe 14 to 18,000 containers on it. And as it enters the waterway, if it takes a left and goes to Prince Rupert or Vancouver, it's going to automatically pay $130 per container less, and the rail rate is up to $400 less per container to have it go directly to Chicago versus taking a right and coming down into the Puget Sound and paying a higher rate on both of those. That is, to me, one of our biggest challenges and what I would like to see be the number one task of our Washington One coalition to address. What I'd like to show you now is something I was looking at that shouldn't just concern us. It should concern us all, but also as an example of what we can do with a Washington One approach that I was speaking of. And it's a great example of a continued approach that Canada has had between their federal, state, and business participation and cooperation. They made a 10-year plan years ago to go after cargo, and Prince Rupert was a large port of that, and they've been incredibly successful. That was phase one, and they're continuing with phase two. I'd like to point out, and this is a road rail utility corridor project aimed at unlocking new terminal developments and gaining more access to the Canadian exporters. It was a joint cooperation investment in part by the Canadian government, British Columbia, CN, which is their railroad, and Canpotex, an example of the not only customers but business involvement. That is in addition to their expansion of the terminals that has already taken place and a phase two completion that is expected in Prince Rupert to double capacity in the next 5 years. 40% of Washington's jobs are in some way related to the shipping industry. The success of Washington's ports must be our first priority. Can you only imagine what would happen if our ports fail? Not only what that would mean to the local jobs, but to all the economy. And we need to start thinking in a wider approach. What does it mean not only for the areas around the ports, what does it mean to the exporters on the other side of the mountains, to those growing hay, to those the apple crops, potatoes? We need a regional solution for the problem we're facing in our ports right now. So where do we go from here? I'm not entirely sure. Is that the Rocky theme you might hear in the background? Probably so. Because when it comes down to it, it's going to take a fight. The competition is fierce, but this is nothing that can't be done. It's going to require a coalition of growers from the east side of the mountain, a coalition made of exporters from the sound and west side of the mountain. It's going to require importers that care about Washington and a thriving state's economy. It's going to take labor and anyone whose jobs are dependent on the ports and their success. And the key component that has to be part of this equation is legislators. Legislators that want Washington to win and aren't worried about a D or an R, but a W. And when we work together with an approach like this, we can win. So my challenge to you is, will you get on board? Will you participate in this coalition? And will you help Washington ports not only thrive, but succeed? Thanks.